Hello, my name's Jeremy Pritchard. I'm an Associate Professor of Criminal Law at the University of Tasmania. And for LawFest, for this particular lecture, we're looking at the topic of the age of criminal responsibility. And the proposal, in fact, the recommendation from many quarters, including the United Nations, that the age of criminal responsibility should be raised to 14. We're going to have four main parts to this little mini lecture. First, we're going to have a look at some big picture issues that are important to have at the back of our mind when we're thinking about this recommendation and about the age of criminal responsibility in general. Then we'll move on to thinking about some key facts, I guess, about how the criminal law treats young offenders currently. Then in the third part, we'll consider some of the main advantages that have been proposed about raising the age of criminal responsibility. And we'll conclude in the fourth part with some cautionary points, just a couple. I don't pretend to have an exhaustive expertise on this topic, but I certainly know enough about criminal law and about young offending to find it fascinating. So I hope you find the area interesting too. Let's start with youth crime. What we know, not just in Australia, but in other countries, is that certainly with some types of offences, we can regularly see young people being overrepresented as an age group. In offences like stealing or sometimes burglary or in some periods, motor vehicle theft. We see proportionately more young people, under the age of 18, being prosecuted for those offences than adults. We also know that often, not always, youth crime is spontaneous and unplanned. That's a polite way of saying that sometimes it's downright stupid, even dangerous. But the point is there that you're unlikely to come across, in the main, that is, setting aside the atypical young offender who you might see, for example, in types of cybercrime, who are very good at hacking or those types of scenarios. Mainly, we're looking at unsophisticated or thinking about unsophisticated offenders. That means that the nature of that profile means that young people tend to also, their offences committed by them, they tend to be easier to detect. Also, young people are are more likely to plead guilty to the police, and they're easier for the police to interview, and consequently they're easier to prosecute. This third point is an important one. Many studies have shown that the majority of young offenders will appear once or twice in the system and then simply not ever appear again. And that has been called, in some studies, the figure is as high as 80 or 90%. And that has been called the maturation effect, referring to the various aspects of life which will encourage young people to desist from antisocial and criminal behaviour. And that includes everything from getting on with life, getting interested in careers of one sort or another, taking responsibility on their shoulders, getting a significant other in their life, all of the kind of range of life events tends to, for the majority of young people, even if they do come in contact with the criminal justice system formally, mean that they drift away from offending behaviour. Some studies have shown, though, that as much as 60% of youth crime that we see recorded on the books, if you like, is in each era committed by a minority of young offenders. So in other words, usually in any one time period, there will be in any jurisdiction like Tasmania or another state or territory, a small group of offenders who are repeat offenders. Recidivists is the term that's used there. And they may commit offences at a very high frequency, to the point where they affect statistics across the board. It is that group in particular that makes us think about the social context of youth crime. Now, I want to be careful here about talking about what are called risk factors and protective factors for youth crime. So these are factors that are correlated with or associated with youth crime. That's called a risk factor, or associated with not offending. That's called a protective factor. These factors, though, are not determinative. And that's really important for us to remember that, for example, you can have a person who has every risk factor that you can think of in their life, but they still might choose never to offend. And conversely, we might have someone who has every protective factor that you could think of. Life's handed to them on a platter, in other words, but they still might choose as a young person or as an adult to commit an offence. So that's important for us to just keep at the back of our mind, and not to be, certainly not to be projecting the message that if certain things happen to young people, they're damaged and they're almost bound to behave in a certain way. That's not the case. Still though, when we look at what the overall patterns that should be of great concern to us as a caring country, as a caring society, these indicate that repeat offending by young people is associated with social disadvantage of one sort or another, including poverty, physical, sexual or emotional abuse, substance use, either by the young person themselves or their parents or guardians, mental illness, the list goes on, poor opportunities with schooling, frequent changes of homes, of place of residence. These are well established. This second dot point is a bit different. This relates to studies that really started to emerge with clear evidence, particularly from the 1970s onwards. I reference there the work of people like David Farrington in the UK and many others in other countries. And what they did was to look at, they conducted longitudinal studies. So they looked at the patterns of young offenders over a long period of time. And what they found was that if young people went to court, just the court appearance itself appeared to increase their risk of future offending. The court appearance itself was, although they didn't use this term back then, itself was a risk factor. And it also showed that the earlier in your life that you had contact with the criminal justice system, the younger you were, in other words, the worse your overall prospects looked on average. In other words, the greater the risk that you would appear again and again and again. Now, there are a whole lot of explanations for this complicated pattern, but one that gathered acceptance, certainly in many circles, revolved around labelling theory and the idea of stigmatisation. And this, in a nutshell, was that particularly with a court appearance, but potentially with other things that might happen within the criminal justice system, for example, being dealt with in a certain way by police officers or that type of thing, that might, for a young person, really affect the way they think about themselves, and that they might take on the label of being an offender, of being bad, being a bad apple, if you like. And that particularly with the formal court process, they might perceive that, especially in the younger their mind was, if they're only 10 or 11, and they go into the big courtroom with all of these official looking people around the place and official sounding language, that experience could be internalized by them to mean that society has formally told me that I'm bad, that I'm a criminal. And the theorising went that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, in other words. So for many decades, there has been an effort to reduce the amount of contact that young people of all ages, but particularly those in the tender years, have with the criminal justice system. We can't talk about the criminal justice system in Australia, let alone the youth justice system, without referencing the important problem of the overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians, Indigenous young Australians in youth criminal detention centres. So the figures vary a lot between the states and territories in Australia. The national level, the average figures indicate that Indigenous youth are 23 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous youth. And in Tasmania, the figure is by it relates to a factor of 5. So Indigenous youth in Tasmania are about 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous youth. How does the criminal law treat young people? How does it think about or broadly deal with young people? Well, the Tasmanian Criminal Code is the most important document here, and it's very similar at the moment to provisions we see in other states and territories. And it's in section 18. This is exactly where we get the rule about the current age of criminal responsibility being 10. So what this means is that the day before your 10th birthday, you could have committed an offence, you could have gone into nub code, let's say, and tried to steal a fantastic socket set for your dad, or some fantastic tools, something along those lines. And you get caught on the way out. And if it was the day before your 10th birthday, the police could not be involved. Other agencies could be involved, of course. Welfare agencies and community agencies of with different roles to play. But there's no role for the criminal law. And then the next day, if on your 10th birthday you've gone to NubGo to steal some tools for your dad or someone else to sell, for example, you're caught, then the police could indeed be involved and decide whether to press charges. Incidentally, if we go far enough back in time, the age of criminal responsibility in the common law countries used to be 7. So the increase from 7 to 10 was considered to be, it was a huge leap forward conceptually. I'm not going to read out subsection 2 of section 18. I'll tell you, you can look at the wording yourself. You can pause the lecture now if you want to read it through. But the essence of it is to implement in the criminal law in Tasmania the principle of doli inca pax. And so this is a Latin term for a principle that applies not just in Tasmania, but in other places around the world. And what this means is that if a young person who is aged between 10 and 13 years is being prosecuted for an offence, then the prosecutor has to not just prove the same types of things that they'd have to do for older people, for example, that it really was them who was trying to steal the tools from Nubco, but that the young person would also have to prove that the young person really understood the moral quality of that act. That it wasn't just that they knew they were being naughty, but that they were doing a serious wrong. So what that's showing us is even in the criminal law as it currently exists, and this is an old provision, the society, social views towards young people in the age bracket of 10 to 13 years have for a long time recognised, though, that in that age group, you may, that developmentally, you may commit an act, may be responsible for what you've done, or you might not quite understand the moral quality of your actions. So that's the current status. The key acts for non-criminal matters in Tasmania are the Children, Young Person and Their Families Act. And for all criminal acts, we have the Youth Justice Act of 1997. And what this act does is to ensure that all young people, and that's defined as people from the age of 10 all the way up to 17, that act tries to divert young people from court to reduce the likelihood that young people ever go to court. And that is in itself reflecting the research I told you about from those earlier decades, that the court experience all by itself can be criminogenic. Thinking about beg your pardon, I skipped ahead a bit there accidentally. Looking at the big picture in Tasmania, if we look at the financial year of 2019 to 2020, we can see that for young people aged 10 to 18 in Tasmania who were under youth justice supervision, across the board we had about 150 young people, but of these only about 6 were in that tender category that we're thinking of, aged 10 to 13 years, and none of those were in detention. So what are some of the main reasons that we should be considering increasing the age of criminal responsibility? Why has the United Nations benchmarked 14 as the recommended age of criminal responsibility? Well, there are a range of different opinions and factors. I just want to put some of the big ones to you here. Certainly in Australia, there are a lot of voices which say that increasing the age of criminal responsibility would help Indigenous youth, that we would just see less Indigenous youth being involved in the criminal justice system and therefore less ever ending up in the youth detention centres. Another claim is that presumption, that principle of dolly incapax that we just looked at a moment ago, a couple of slides ago in section 18, subsection 2. Many observers claim that dolly incapax is an insufficient protection for 10 to 13-year-olds. It doesn't work well enough. That's a claim across Australia, not peculiar to Tasmania. The other third main point is that by increasing the age of criminal responsibility to 14 years, that there'd be greater opportunity for developmentally appropriate and trauma-informed early intervention to take place, so that more sophisticated systems could be used that really looked after those young people, even if in that 10 to 13 age bracket, even if there was serious behaviour, if there were and the potential of harm arising from their behaviour. And the evidence backing this comes from a range of disciplines, but certainly psychology, even Piaget, if you've been studying some of the antecedents of child psychology. More recently, of course, the science that is coming out about neurophysiology. There are various indicators, some modern and some older, that indicate that children aged between 10 to 13 years cannot properly comprehend the implications of serious acts. And I think this is a serious and important issue to consider. And I actually think as time goes by, this argument is becoming more and more cogent. It's becoming a stronger and stronger argument because we're seeing kind of an ever-increasing complexity in the criminal laws. There are, it's rare to hear of criminal laws being completely repealed. So what we see in Tasmania and across Australia, and remember that amendments made to some acts like the Commonwealth Criminal Code apply here in Tasmania too, we see an increase in the number of different crimes. And one of the areas not just in the number of crimes on the book, so to speak, but in the complexity of those crimes, the nuances they involve, in other words. And in some of those areas that I know well, in really over the last decade in particular, I've really studied certain types of cybercrime. And in some of those crimes, I can see that the average adult, honestly, would be forgiven for not understanding exactly what the boundary was between criminal and non-criminal behaviour. And so I do have, serious concerns that young people should be expected in those realms to be knowing about the existence of those criminal laws, and even if they did know about them, actually understand the moral implications of some criminal acts. All right, so you can see that my general tenor is that I'm thinking that this is a good idea. But as I said at the outset, I don't pretend to be to have an exhaustive knowledge or expertise on this topic. And I would welcome points of view coming from different angles in questions, so that we could discuss this from different perspectives. There are, however, and this is the last slide, and I'll finish after this slide. There are two what I've called cautionary points that I think we should keep in mind if this reform is introduced. Some of you may have read Dickens' novel, popular novel, Oliver Twist, and here I've representing an image of Oliver Twist from the movie of the same name. When was it? In the 1970s or 80s? And that's showing one of the characters in Oliver Twist, Fagin. And what Fagin used to do was to bring young, what they were called urchins. He'd look after them, but then he'd train them to become pickpockets and send them out to commit offences and to bring all the loot back. And they'd all work together as a team. Now, not for a moment go to blow this particular issue out of proportion. One small thing I think we're going to keep an eye on, though, if the age of criminal responsibility is increased to 14, is we'll have to be thinking about what to do when we can see that those aged 10 to 13 have been manipulated to commit offences by adults or by older teens. And this isn't, incidentally, a quirky hypothetical. Police officers and people who work in relevant sectors will tell you that they have encountered situations, maybe not frequently, but every now and again, where they know that adults have, we might say, aided and abetted or instigated young people to commit offences for them. And it's not a new phenomenon. In fact, the code in section 3.2 has a provision exactly for this type of context that's been there, as far as I can tell, since 1924, when the code was enacted. And it's to make people like Fagin guilty of offences committed by innocent agents, that is, by people including people under the age of criminal responsibility. So one small thing that crosses my mind is if we increase the age of criminal responsibility, policing services and other agencies will need to be thinking about what to do with this type of context. My final point is more relates to the quality of practice. This change in the criminal law, this change in policy and direction seems very convincing, doesn't it? If we properly fund and can maintain best practice standards or well-practiced standards in relation to early intervention strategies. What we've seen, though, and I'm referencing here a work from the late 1980s by a historian called John Seymour, who looked at youth justice over about a century in Australia, and he went into a great amount of detail to what happened in the different states and territories. And at one stage of my research, I found that book, entirely pertinent, because you saw different types of attempts to deal with young offenders. And certainly within that book, there are several examples of what I've described as well-intended welfare interventions. And I'll start again. There's examples in that book, very well documented, of well-intended interventions for welfare nature that treated young people actually more harshly than adults would have been treated for the same behaviour. What were the examples? Well, some of them related to, now this is going back many decades, of course, but at some periods of time, influenced by the very early notions of the child saving movement and then other influences along the way, there was very much a push to not view young people as criminals, but as misguided and misdirected. That's the exact terminology of the old legislation in Tasmania, the Child Welfare Act of 1960 in Section 4. But that encouraged sometimes agencies to take young boys, young girls out of their homes, away from their families, and to put them into boys' homes or girls' homes. And if we look at that, at what the state is actually doing there, well, arguably the case that John Seymour put forward was, wow, that was a type of incarceration, wasn't it? That was a breach of the liberty of the young person's, their right to liberty. And this was of particular concern where we could see that for a certain set of behaviour, the not always just criminal, but maybe just antisocial behaviour, the state would intervene in sometimes a heavy-handed way in the lives of young people, whereas if the same behaviour had occurred among adults, the state's reaction through the criminal justice system was much less severe. It might not involve any incarceration, or if it did involve incarceration, it would be for a much shorter period of time. I didn't explain that last point very succinctly, I'm sorry. But maybe I could summarise it this way. Let's make sure we don't have bracket creep. With the replacement, with whatever we bring in to replace and look after that cohort of 10 to 13, let's make sure, not just now, but in perpetuity, going forward, not just into the medium term, but well into the long term, that we don't fall into some of those traps that we saw occurred under the welfare model. Okay, all right, I'll leave that there. I hope at least some of that was interesting and engaging. I'm looking forward to getting your questions and to be able to respond to them for Lawfest. Bye.